Although I am an active member of the Church of Satan, I do not speak for the Church of Satan.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 18 of the Undertaking Satan podcast. I, of course, am your host, Grenal. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for just a little bit. What are we tackling in this episode? Well, we're tackling a topic that's sort of difficult, it seems, for people to get their head around. And this, of course, as the title suggests, is the idea of stratification versus egalitarianism. I take pride in the fact that Undertaking Satan, in accordance with satanic philosophy, is really an apolitical podcast. I don't care what anyone's personal politics are. However, in the day and age that we live in, it's very difficult to run a podcast of any sort and not get, I wouldn't say bombarded, but at least have questions pop up. Instead of just giving a very didactic answer, which I believe other Satanists have done way better a job at, I'm going to do things by telling you some personal stories and then filling in the philosophical part at the end. So, without further ado, here are two stories from Grendel's past that illustrate the ideas of egalitarianism versus stratification. I'm going to tell these two stories in chronological order. One happened way before the other. Both are deeply personal. Names have been changed to protect, well, everyone, I suppose. However, I do want to speak just a little bit about an accomplishment that I've made. Not too long ago, I did a episode in honor of Anton LaVey. That episode was all about the carnival life. The Carnival Spirit was the title. And in that episode, I mentioned I had previously worked as a rides operator. That was a very fulfilling job for me, and I've always wanted to find a way to be both a funeral director, embalmer, and somehow work the carnival lifestyle into what it is that I do. I'm happy to say that I've done that. I'm not going to go into detail, except to say that I will be returning to my carnival, well, in this case, amusement park roots, and that I'm very happy to announce that. But without further ado, let's get to the first story. When Grendel was just a little tyke in kindergarten, I had a best friend, my first ever best friend. And his name was Jason, if it matters. Jason, in my estimation, was probably the coolest best friend that I ever had. I've always been into sports. Even in preschool, my parents had me enrolled in, like t-ball, and I think I was even wrestling back then. And I enjoyed sports, but I enjoyed them during sporting times. To me, I enjoyed sports when I went to practice or when I played in a game or wrestled in a wrestling meet or whatever it was that I was doing. At school, specifically at recess, I did not want to play sports. At recess, I wanted to explore and create things with my mind and have little imaginative plays. That seemed way more fun to me. So all of my sporting friends, they weren't interested. They wanted to go kick a ball around or do whatever. I wanted to reenact these little plays I had in my head. I wanted to kind of flex my magical muscles as a child, not even knowing that they were magical muscles. Specifically what it was is I was obsessed with two things. The show, Walker, Texas Ranger, and the Power Rangers. And both of these things centered around kind of the early 90s idea of Kung Fu. We all remember pre-mixed martial arts, the idea that Kung Fu was, or karate, was the ultimate end-all be-all, and anyone could walk into a karate dojo and learn to fight, and it would be awesome. This is what was sold on pretty much every TV show. Do you have confidence problems? Well, learn martial arts. This sort of thing. I was hooked. At recess, I wanted to go out and I wanted to fight imaginary creatures and imaginary enemies, and none of my sporting friends wanted to do this. But Jason was more than willing. He was actually more willing than I was. His mind was very, very creative. His mind, I could tell, even at a very young age, worked very differently than my own. I really love that because the stories in my head and the fighting the imaginary creatures, they all became better because of Jason's ideas and because of Jason's input and his willingness and passion for the project that we were sharing. That's a very intense way to put kindergartners kicking the air, but that's alas, that's what it was. Then I started to realize as the friendship matured that I started getting treated differently because I was Jason's friend. Jason and I got to do things that other kids didn't get to do, like go first in the lunch line. We got to go out to recess 5 minutes early while everyone else sat in their seats. Teachers started giving me little awards and little things saying like world's best friend, kind of confusing me, to tell you the truth. And it wasn't until much later that I realized that Jason had an intellectual disability. An adult now and have went through psychological training. I have a 4-year degree in psychology, so I'm pretty sure I can safely say that he was autistic and probably suffered from fetal alcohol abuse. As an adult, looking back, I understand what his life was like. As a child, he was the ultimate best friend. Why am I bringing this up? Well, we'll take a look at the specifics after story number 2. Story number 2 has to do with my first day on the job as a young amusement rides operator. And let me kind of fill you in on how that came to be. Without boring everyone, this was after I had graduated from a 4-year college. I had started mortuary school, actually. I had been living in a funeral home, working with a funeral director that was kind of wanting to take me under his wing as a protege. However, I received a job offer from a place that was offering a position that in my state of residence is actually kind of hard to get. Basically, you get a licensed psychologist pay without being an actual psychologist. And they do this by putting you in charge of a group home or set of group homes. Basically, the idea was that you and the nurse acted as a team underneath a licensed psychologist to take care of the needs of people who had been committed or had intellectual disabilities and were assigned to this housing program. Did that for a while, made quite a good living at it. However, as it turned out, I met a girl, attempted to start a family. That didn't work out. Abbreviated version is it basically kind of left me in ruin for a little while. Old Grendel was pretty aimless, pretty sad, pretty down in the dumps. I do credit Satanism for helping me through that time. I discovered I was a Satanist pretty young at the age of, I think it was probably 13 or 14. That story is back in episode 1. The ideas of don't quit, hey, life is the great indulgence and death is the great abstinence, really meant a lot, if that makes sense. Sometimes that thought was the only thing that kept me going during those times, to tell you the truth. But I digress. What that looked like for me was basically this big depression, anxious panic disorder type of scenario where I'm living on my family's couch, kind of the prodigal son fallen from greatness, if that makes sense. Drinking till I black out pretty much every day. Sad, right? Disgusting is more of an accurate word. Finally, I took a walk with my mom one day, ironically in a cemetery, not sure why. And she just, pitched it back to me. Hey, you were really happy when you were going to mortuary school and trying to be a funeral director. maybe you should return to that. And that was good advice. I took that, got back into the program, but problem was when I got back into the program, when I signed up, that was, I believe, late winter. I couldn't start until the next fall semester. So basically, I had an entire summer where I just was still in limbo. However, I did kind of get the creative juices flowing. I'm like, hey, I need to clean myself up and I need to do something. For the past few months prior to this, I had been completely unemployed. I think that was the only time I've ever been unemployed. I had to find a gig. I batted things around in my head, what do I want to do, whatever. One day I happened to be driving by an amusement park in my area, and it just clicked. Said, hey, you don't want anything too hard, like taxing on the mind. Really, the idea is just to kill some time, get some coin in the pocket for when you're going back to mortuary school. So that was the idea of how I started at this amusement park. This was this was in the, I would guess, 2017, something of that nature, 2018 maybe. But this place was kind of stuck in the past, and I liked it a lot. It was not a corporate place at this point. It was still owned by one family. The hiring process was literally me walking in and shaking someone's hand and then putting my John Hancock on a couple of forms, and that was it. And then off to work I went. First day on the job. And this is kind of a little bit of amusement ride operation insider here. I get assigned to be the assistant on the big wheel. Okay. A big wheel is very similar to a Ferris wheel. It is not a Ferris wheel. I got scolded by the person I'm about to tell you about because I called it a Ferris wheel. So I never really made that mistake again. But basically, assisting on that ride, if you've ever ridden a sky wheel or anything of that nature, very simple. You hold the door open, you stabilize the gondola so the folks can get in and get out. It's a very slow moving operating ride, so it is dangerous, I suppose, but it's not overly dangerous. Just don't get hit in the head with a big spinning stationary wheel is really the only rule. So they put people there because it's the easiest job in the park on their first day. To tell you the truth, as I said back then, I was suffering pretty hardcore from compulsion instead of indulgence, if that makes sense, with the booze, as it were. So I was hungover. It's cold. This would have been starting day. So that would have been back at that time. They were starting the 1st of April, I believe. It was still really cold, but it was pretty busy because it was opening day, and that was kind of a big deal. The guy operating the ride is this grizzled carny, and I call him a carny because he would be mad at me if I called him anything else. I don't know if this person is still alive. I doubt it. He was very old at the time that I knew him. His name was Jack. Jack was this shriveled, angry old man who wore a veteran's cap and had all these pins in it from all the different companies he had worked for. He was basically an old school traveling carny that needed to retire and just retired into working at amusement parks. Also retired into an RV. There was a RV ground or camp, I suppose you call it, very close to the park that catered to seasonal employees very well and took care of them pretty nicely. So that was his gig, what he did. He disappeared on the last day of the season. He reappeared on the first day of the season. He was just this old grumpy asshole, And he hated new people. He absolutely hated what he called greenies, which were just, you're greener than baby shit, was his term. You don't know anything about the business. He was an old school showman. First one of my mistakes was when we had gone to start the day and open up the ride, I had called it a Ferris wheel. And he had jumped down my throat and very quickly explained to me the difference between a Ferris wheel and what we were running. A Ferris wheel is geared, so they're generally smaller, and this was the sky wheel that I was working is 100-foot sky wheel. Actually, I think it's 90, but we just call it a 100-foot sky wheel. A sky wheel runs on the friction of four basically tractor tires, and I'm not talking like big giant tractors. I'm talking like the tires that are on your riding lawnmower on the front left. You know what I mean? The very small ones. Basically, they look like little donuts. Those compress the wheel on the two sides where it meets the frame. This is important because, and I didn't know this at the time, the assistant for the big wheel or the sky wheel or whatever you want to call it is the easiest job in the park. The operator of the wheel is the hardest job in the park. It's really the only job in the park at that time where the operator was in such control that if they messed up, the fire department would be called. You have to have that ride completely balanced at all times. So you have to keep track back then in your head of exactly, how much weight, how many people were distributed between the cars. And then run time was all manual. You had to, count your time, and it's a whole thing. I did end up running the wheel at the end of my tenure, which is kind of cool. It's like, I don't know. It's the big accolade in the park. Let's get back to the first day on the job. So it's really it's going to be about midday, going to be about lunchtime. I go to lunch back at the break room, come back, and I notice this kid in line. This kid has external hearing aids mounted to the side of his head, the type that, are like basically stuck to the bone. And you can tell that this kid wasn't having a good time. I was watching him go through the switchbacks, watching him go through the line. His parents were trying to communicate with him using sign language. The kid was just not responding. This resonated with me because in the job that I had left, part of my training was sign language. Basically, the idea was that nonverbal individuals, we served a lot of autistic people. We would train people in sign language. So it wasn't fluent or anything like that, but I knew the basic signs, and I understood how hard it was to get somebody to sign to you when they don't want to, and that kind of lack of communication. At this point, it's cold out still, just families trying to have a good time. Mom and dad are obviously down in the dumps, kids down in the dumps. They're trying to get him to sign. He's almost throwing a fit and a tantrum. Just the whole thing. And I'm just kind of watching this as they move into the line. Finally, they come up. They come over to my side. I get him in a gondola. And then Jack, who's this stoic, grumpy figure. So Jack gets the kid's attention and points left or right, and then keeps doing that. The kid's obviously confused, and he understands that Jack's letting him pick which way the wheel is going to run. That's very, very against code, by the way. You can do it, but it's if you get caught, it's a whole thing. But for this kid, Jack was going to run the wheel backwards. And the kid just started lighting up, and he started signing to his parents, right? Just as fast as he could sign, and the parents were automatically happy, and it was just like this little moment. I learned a lot from Jack. He was one of the most interesting humans I ever met. We kind of bonded over him teaching me about rides. That was really his passion. He had done nothing else but the carnival since he had gotten back from the war. I think he was married at one point, but basically it was just him and his pet bird. I don't know. I thought it was a parrot. I think it's bigger than a parrot, and it talked. It was just him, his parrot, and his caricatures that he would draw every day in his trailer. He was also a very heavy drinker. One day, this was end of the season, after I got to know Jack, Jack invited me back for a drink at his place, like I said, which was an RV in this little campground very near the park, walking distance actually. I go in there, and I saw for probably the first time, although I might have seen it before because I had been kind of going on removals at the first funeral home that I worked at, a scene that you see in when you go to pick up an alcoholic who killed themselves with alcohol, basically. Just piles of the cheapest vodka bottles you've ever seen in the corners, just, floor to ceiling. And that was very much the case in his trailer. Sort of like organized chaos madness. I'm sitting there, I think I had a case of beer or something, and he's just pounding this giant handle of vodka. I honestly couldn't believe that a human being could drink that much and still function. I asked if he drank throughout the day. We got into the cups a little bit. And then one of the things he says, nah, kid. Kid was what he called me all the time. He said, nah, kid, because I don't want to kill anybody on a ride. And so the only drink that I have on the days that I work is the initial drink in the morning to stop myself from shaking. And then I go the rest of the day dry till I get back, which, knowing what I know about alcoholism, and is very hard to do. But he did it. He made up for it. He drank an entire handle of vodka from the time that he got off work to that last drink before when he got up in the morning and went back to the park. I don't really get emotional on this podcast much, but this is just, that's where kind of the idea of like, hey, you got to get your drinking under control came from. And the idea that the park kind of saves. The idea that the amusement worlds, the carnival scene has its own magic to it. And that, my friends, is very satanic. So those are the two stories. What do they have in common? What are they for? Alright, so what do these two stories have to do with stratification or egalitarianism or whatnot? The concepts of egalitarianism and stratification are very flatly outlined in Satanism, which one is good and which one is bad. However, I'll go into just my definition of what each one is. Egalitarianism obviously stems from the word equal. This is the idea that everyone is completely the same. This is the idea that suggests that the goal of life is for everyone to be exactly equal in every sense of the word. And thus, if we were all equal, there would be no differences to fight over. This is not a satanic concept. This is an anti-satanic concept. This is the idea that everyone has to get the exact amount of absolutely everything in order to negate conflict. I also want to relate this to the death industry and just death in general. In Satanism, we say that life is the great indulgence and death is the great abstinence. I take it a step further and I say that life is all about stratification, which of course Satanism teaches, and death is egalitarianism. The only way that we can become truly equal is to all die. And that is a terrible scenario for the Satanist because we live for the here and now. Whenever I hear concepts of egalitarianism, and this is where it gets slightly political, but people talking about things like communism or Buddhism even, the idea of getting rid of all pleasure, all pain, and just living in Zen nothingness. My answer to that is, a bullet to the head does the exact same thing now, doesn't it? And that's not a good thing in my estimation by any extent of the imagination. Conversely, stratification is a satanic ideal that states that everything finds its own place in nature. I don't really even know why there's any sort of argument over the reality of this. To me, it's always been very simple, and it's always been a very hopeful thing. This suggests that no matter how good you are at something, there's always somebody who's better than you, and there's always somebody who's worse than you. Now, obviously, except for, I suppose, if somebody is truly, truly horrible at something, and they're the worst person at it on the planet, then they can still go up. If you take away ideas of stratification, you take away ideas of the underdog, and you take away the ideas of individuality and the beauty inside of individuality. Stratification also opens the doorway for a lot of the negative criticism that is completely unfounded in my estimation, when it comes to Satanism and the idea that Satanism is somehow promoting fascism. Fascism, for those who don't know, is the idea that there should be a ruling class. And generally that ruling class should be the wealthiest and most educated and most able to be in that position. And although I will not deny that this is what Satanism talks about to some extent, that's not a caste system. That's movable. You can move up and down that scale. You can move up and down that stratified ladder, if that makes sense. This idea suggests that there's going to be someone at the head of the table and someone at the end of the table. Now, what people tend to miss is the idea that just because this is reality, and Satanism didn't invent this idea, if you look at nature, the weaker animal dies. The stronger animal survives to procreate. We have these things, these concepts of natural selection and evolution. All of this stuff just seems to be simple in my estimation, but a lot of folks have severe amounts of trouble with it. That brings me to these two stories and why I told them. If you get rid of the idea of stratification and you try to make everyone equal, you get rid of uniqueness. In my first story, my friend Jason, in every other situation in his life, he was at the bottom of the stratification ladder. He was poor. He was mentally disabled. He was abused as a child, I'm sure. He did not do well in school. He couldn't really even operate without a severe amount of help. However, me not knowing what was going on, none of that stuff mattered. None of that stratification mattered. The only stratification, the only category that I cared about was how good he was at helping me play my games and live out my little fantasies during recess. The lesson we need to learn here is just because somebody is at the top in one category doesn't mean they can't be at the bottom in another category, or vice versa. This is where the true evil of idiocy and stupidity, which is stupidity, of course, being the number one satanic sin, is the idea of applying this philosophy to groups indiscriminately. So this is where people who just don't get the concept say things like, people from this country are all at the bottom and people from this country are on the top. People of this color are at the bottom. People of this color are at the top. People of this gender are at the bottom. People of that gender are at the top. When you apply it to groups and you get rid of individuality, that's when you get stupidity growing. And sadly, there are groups out there who are not Satanists but claim to be, and they do embrace these stupid concepts. If you were to ask one of these black sun chasing neo-Nazi assholes, a woman can never be as good as a man. People with a higher melanin count are always going to be subjugated to the rule of people with a lesser melanin count. This is not what I'm about. This is not what Satanism's about. To me, if you read the literature, if you read through all of the canon of the Church of Satan, this is very, very apparent. But, alas, you can't get people to read the back of a fucking cereal box nowadays, let alone an entire book. That's what story number 1 was talking about. Story number 2 has to do a little bit with eating crow and a little bit with getting knocked down a peg or two. In that story, just to recap briefly, we talked about the fact that I was this educated psychologist guy with this really fancy cool job, working a sky wheel with this old grizzled carny who I don't believe even had a high school education. However, in that specific story with the little boy coming through the line and getting him to sign just by doing something very, very simple, well, it wasn't exactly that simple. I mean, he'd have a giant wheel to use as a magical tool. But just with that little itty-bitty piece of lesser magic, which Jack was inclined to use. And I think that rule applies to a lot of carnival folk. I think that's why it's embedded so much into the philosophy of Satanism, because again, it was created by Anton LaVey, who spent a great deal of time in showmanship. But on that day, Jack beat the hell out of the fancy kid with the fancy degree. Jack was able to get that kid to communicate and have a good time, when that's what I had been spending 4 years, and then all of the training and all the stuff that I had done during my psychological employment. That's what I was supposed to be good at, but alas, I was half hungover holding open a door while this old grizzled carny was doing a better job than I had ever done in all of my time. Supposedly, on that stratification level, on the psychological stratification level, I was supposed to be at the top, Jack was supposed to be at the bottom. But on that day, it didn't matter, did it? Jack was on top and I was on the bottom, just because I was a miserable piece of shit at the time, and Jack was also sort of a miserable piece of shit, but at least was using his misery and using his magic to do something worthwhile. I'll close with this. Every Satanist experiences it. I think Magister Bill M. was the last one I heard talk about it over on Satanist Plane. The idea that Satanism is pegged with everything, every bad, nasty, bad guy word, from fascist all the way to liberal idiot. They try to peg absolutely everything on us because shit doesn't stick. It's really hard to pin moss on a rolling stone, if that makes sense. When you embrace the adversary as your archetype, people don't even know where to start when they get into a battle with you, whether that's a battle of wits or whatever. If you don't have a good guy badge, it's really hard to throw mud on your good guy persona. So, if you hear someone or see someone online calling a Satanist a fascist, a race traitor, it goes all over the place, right?